Hey, I want to talk a little bit about one of the side effects of the coronavirus, which is being dubbed by many sources the Wuhan coronavirus, and that is this perception of anti-Chinese bigotry. Now, there's a number of angles to take with this. I'd kind of been thinking about this video for a while because it's something that I'd noticed, but kind of the icing on the cake, so to speak. I've just come off my QQ account. And one of my students, my former students, had posted this video of a guy speaking in English, claiming that back in 2009, no one called the H1N1 virus the American virus because, as he put it, it was detected there. Well, automatically, that's not true. The first strain of H1N1 in which it was declared a pandemic was actually in Veracruz, Mexico. And I'm old enough to remember at the time, this was 11 years ago. Some sources were calling that the Mexico flu or the Mexican flu. It's also known as the H1N1 pandemic, the bird flu. There was numerous names for it. Usually with pandemics, they don't get one epithet. They don't get one name. There's usually more than one going around. Um, but anyway, the point here is that the guy was trying to make out that it's just the world picking on China. But in 1918, the pandemic of that year was named the Spanish flu because that's where it was first it may not have originated in Spain, but that is where it was first recognized as a pandemic. And one of the theories, as I understand it, and I may be wrong about this, but I think one of the reasons that it spread so fast and so catastrophically was because of troop movements. So American troops returning from I guess it would have been the Italian front, going through Spain, had carried the disease and it was first detected there, hence it became known as the Spanish flu. So there we have it already, Mexico flu, Spanish flu. So this idea that, and there was the Asian flu in 1957, Hong Kong flu in 1968. There's many examples of pandemics being named after the location. Um, so this is basically I was a bit irritated by that, and I did write a message underneath, sort of pointing out that it wasn't accurate because I noticed a number of my former students were liking the post, like, "Oh yes, this guy is pointing out the whole thing here is, oh, there's some big conspiracy against China." Well, firstly, if there are people blaming individual Chinese, like giving them a hard time, that's wrong. Um, but I think that Chinese media always does this. They always promote this victimhood narrative, like the world versus China. Um, Someone I know well actually contacted me the other day, and she said, "Nathan, what do you think of the world versus China on the Wuhan coronavirus?" And I was like, "Whoa, step back a little bit. That's hardly the situation." But there are a few things that are irrefutable. This did begin in China. It began in Wuhan, and almost certainly in the market, the so-called wet market. Um, Most sources seem to indicate that is what happened, and even most people in China accept that. So the fact that this began in China shouldn't be controversial. That's just what happened. And I also think that this is going to have to change the culture of this demand for exotic animals. Now, pointing that out and talking about that factor as the source of this is not the same as vilifying the Chinese people or saying that they're all engaged in eating exotic animals because they're not. And I can say, by the way, for anyone who does think that that's not the case, they don't do that. It's true that there are people in China who do that. It is true that there is a demand in China for it. It is true that China's animal welfare record is appalling. I'm not going to I'm not going to pretend otherwise. I've seen it, and frankly, there were things I saw out there that made my stomach turn in terms of the way certain animals were treated. And yeah, you get it all over the world, but I do think China has a particularly bad record. The whole thing about saving face, it's again this thing about Chinese sensitivity. If you're Chinese and you think that people are blaming you for the coronavirus, you have my sympathy if that's actually happening, i.e., if someone has been rude to you, it's wrong, right? But if you're just assuming that based on what Chinese media is telling you, based on the sensitivities of your countrymen and women, I would say just judge for yourself. Um, Governments around the world have a right to protect their own citizens. And so, if they take certain measures, for example, they check Chinese nationals coming in, that isn't discrimination, that is just practical. People who may be from Wuhan. Um, because this is not the time to be politically correct, which is, if you don't know what that means, it means basically, try not to offend people for the greater good. This is a situation where the absolute priority is public safety. That's above anything else. So it may be that some people are taking the bigoted attitude and sort of taking this generic attitude against the Chinese, which is wrong because, among other reasons, it's not accurate to say that all Chinese people are engaged in eating exotic animals. That's not the case. However, it happens, right? And no Chinese national should be denying that. It does happen, okay? If you're Chinese and you're saying that doesn't happen, you're simply lying, or you're in denial, or you're not paying attention. So don't blame the rest of the world because the rest of the world sees this going on in Chinese markets. And to be fair, it isn't just China, it probably happens in other Asian countries as well. But I do think that should be, and not just Asian countries, other parts of the world. Um, Parts of Latin America, for example, there's delicacies and insects. And what I pointed out to my acquaintance was that, we had a situation back in the mid 90s, 1996 to be precise, BSE, so-called mad cow disease, Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease. Now, it wasn't on the scale of this, but it did create a period of where British beef wasn't being touched. It's kind of a backlash against British beef, and that would have, as I understand it, had quite an impact on British agriculture, and even more so 5 years later with the foot and mouth outbreak in 2001. So that I remember at that time, like not directly because I was only 11 years old, but I've looked, I've seen the archives and news reports and so on, and at the time there was kind of I wouldn't say anti-British sentiments, but there was sort of this idea of, oh, it's British beef, it's bad, and I guess there was some defensive attitudes in this country, sort of embarrassment or resentment, even that British beef was being blacklisted. But other countries that presumably was the practical thing for them to do. Um, so what I would say is that I see a problem with so-called Sinophobia in the sense that it's a bit like Islamophobia. It can be used as a way to deflect legitimate criticism. For example, I think the criticism of these markets is absolutely legitimate, and many Chinese have been criticizing them, not just because they find it embarrassing, but they know it's a problem because the hygiene standards are low and because it's just reckless having a lot of exotic animals in that sort of situation, in that sort of context. So clearly there is something that's going to have to change there. And I think the Chinese government will recognize that. Ironically, it's one situation where their authoritarianism may paradoxically be a good thing. And, it's hardly ever you will hear me say that. But, if it means enforcing certain animal welfare codes or hygiene standards, I'm all for that. You know, um, So I don't think the world is blaming the Chinese in the sense that I don't think there's this kind of mass bigotry going on against the Chinese people. I haven't seen it. If you are Chinese and you've personally experienced it, you have my absolute sympathy. You shouldn't be given a hard time because of your nationality. But at the same time, don't get so nationalistic and defensive just because the rest of the world is taking precautions. Okay? Um, and if you want to blame someone, then blame this practice of having exotic animals that demand in wet markets. That's a problem, okay? So don't blame the rest of the world. Anyway, that's my take. It did begin in China. That doesn't mean that all the Chinese people should be blamed. It doesn't excuse anti-Chinese racism, but simply criticizing the market and even any way in which this has been dealt with is not xenophobic and it's not racist. And, if we go down that path, that's utterly pathetic. Chinese state media is always pushing sensitivities, it's always pushing nationalistic sentiments, but there's no excuse for that to be happening in the West.